Last time we arrived at a rather peculiar question. If occult resonance really exists, what exactly is resonating? I want to ask you a question. Why have so many civilizations, separated by thousands of kilometers, speaking different languages, believing different things, all concluded that the human being cannot be fully understood as a physical organism alone? Was this simply a coincidence? Or were they all pointing toward something we have forgotten? Today, let's investigate. If we wanted to investigate whether the human being possesses an invisible dimension, perhaps the first witness we should question is one of the oldest continuous spiritual civilizations in human history, India. For thousands of years, its philosophers, sages, and spiritual practitioners returned again and again to one extraordinary question. What exactly is a human being? What is remarkable is that they did not all answer the same question in the same way. Over the centuries, India gave birth to an extraordinary family of philosophical and spiritual traditions. Some understood their deepest insights as godly revelation, preserved in sacred texts. Others emphasized philosophical inquiry. Others focused on direct inner realization through disciplined spiritual practice. They often disagreed, sometimes profoundly. Yet, despite this remarkable diversity, they kept returning to one striking intuition, that the human being cannot be fully understood as a physical organism alone. Among these traditions, one of the oldest and most influential was Samkhya, which sought to understand reality by analyzing the fundamental principles underlying existence, or in the Sanskrit language, the tattvas. Another one of these traditions, yoga, turned that vision into a practical path of inner exploration, describing the human being as a multi-layered reality through concepts such as the Koshas, or the subtle sheaths, and mapping subtle centers and channels of power and consciousness that many people today know as the chakras and NDEs. And we will do deep dives into these topics from an esoteric perspective later down the road on this channel. Vedanta explored the deepest nature of the self. Kashmir Shaivism developed a profound and intricate vision of consciousness and manifestation. The details differ, sometimes significantly. But across this extraordinary landscape of ideas, one conviction appears again and again. The visible body is only part of what a human being is. Whatever conclusions we eventually reach, it is difficult not to admire the seriousness with which these questions were pursued. So our first witness leaves us with a question. Why did an entire civilization, through multiple independent schools of thought, repeatedly arrive at the conclusion that there is more to us than the physical body? Was this simply a shared cultural inheritance? Or were they all pointing toward something they believed they had genuinely discovered? If India had been the only civilization to describe an invisible dimension of the human being, we might simply conclude that this was one particular cultural idea. But India was not alone. In another of humanity's great civilizations, ancient China, we find a remarkably similar investigation unfolding. Although India and China influenced one another in various ways over the centuries, each developed its own distinctive language, its own conceptual framework, and its own understanding of the human being. Across several of its most influential traditions, philosophers, physicians, Taoist practitioners, and even generations of martial artists, we encounter the same fundamental intuition that the human being cannot be fully understood through the physical body alone. Instead, Chinese thought came to understand life through the concept of qi, a subtle, vital force believed to underlie the dynamic processes of all life. It described an intricate network of meridians through which qi was believed to circulate, together with important energy centers known as the Dantians. Rather than the Koshas and Chakras described in parts of the Indian tradition, China developed its own language, its own maps, and its own methods. Yet somehow it arrived at a remarkably similar intuition. This vision did not remain only a philosophical idea. It became deeply woven into Chinese civilization. It shaped traditional Chinese medicine, where practices such as acupuncture sought to influence this invisible network in order to restore balance and health. It inspired disciplines such as Qigong and Tai Chi, and became part of the inner training of many traditional martial arts. Whatever conclusions we eventually reach, it is difficult not to also admire the seriousness with which these ideas were explored and developed. So our second witness leaves us with another question. How did two great civilizations with different histories, different languages, different philosophies, and different ways of investigating reality both arrive at the conclusion that the human being is more than a physical organism? Coincidence? Perhaps. Or are they beginning to point toward the same hidden reality? At this point, we might be tempted to think that the idea of an invisible dimension of the human being belongs mainly to the great traditions of the East. Yet, our investigation would be incomplete without considering one more great spiritual tradition: Christianity. Although its language, its theology, and its spiritual aims differ profoundly from those of China or India, Christianity too preserves a remarkable tradition of inner exploration, beginning with Jesus Christ himself, continuing through the Desert Fathers, the hesychast tradition of the Christian East, and the great Christian mystics of both East and West. Generations of men and women devoted their lives to one central goal: the transformation of the human being through communion with God and His love, mercy, truth, etc. Their vocabulary was completely different. They did not speak of ki, or chakras, or koshas. Yet, they repeatedly spoke of something just as remarkable: the inner man, the heart, the soul, and in Christian East especially, the nous, the spiritual faculty through which the human person comes to know God. The words of Jesus himself express this distinction with striking clarity. Quote, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul." Unquote. The Apostle Paul writes, quote, "Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day." And elsewhere, also he says, quote, "There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body." So you see, different language, different symbols, different methods. Yet once again, we encounter a remarkably familiar intuition that the human being cannot be understood only in terms of the physical body. Whatever conclusions we eventually reach, it is again difficult not to admire the seriousness with which these questions were explored also in the Christian tradition, not only through theology, but through centuries of contemplative practice. So now we are left with a remarkable picture. Three great civilizations or traditions, three different languages, or several for that matter, three radically different ways of understanding the world. Yet all three preserve in their own unique way the conviction that the human being possesses an inner reality beyond the physical body. Could they all have been mistaken? Or were they each describing the same hidden dimension of the human being in different words? So, up to this point, our investigation has explored how humanity's great spiritual traditions understood the human being. They differ profoundly in language, culture, philosophy, and religion. Yet each in its own way preserved the intuition that the human being is more than a physical organism. Now, let's set those traditions aside for a moment and ask a different question. Have ordinary people ever reported experiences that seem difficult to explain if consciousness is entirely confined to the brain? If so, what exactly did they experience? One of the most studied categories of such experiences is known as the near-death experience, or an NDE. These are reports from people who came dangerously close to death, or who were clinically dead for a period of time, before being successfully resuscitated. Across cultures, across religions, and sometimes among people with no religious beliefs at all, many describe remarkably similar elements. A feeling of leaving the physical body, observing events from above, an unusual sense of clarity, encounters with deceased loved ones, or an overwhelming feeling of peace and love. Naturally, experiences like these remain the subject of scientific debate, and different explanations have been proposed. But among the thousands of documented reports, one case has become particularly well known: the case of Pam Reynolds. In 1991, Pam Reynolds underwent an extraordinarily delicate operation to remove a giant aneurysm at the base of her brain. During the procedure, her body temperature was lowered dramatically. Her heartbeat and breathing were stopped. Blood circulation to her brain was temporarily halted, and her brain activity was closely monitored. After recovering, she reported something extraordinary. She claimed that she had perceived parts of the operation from a point outside her body. She described conversations between members of the surgical team, and even a surgical instrument that she later compared to an electric toothbrush. Members of the medical team recognized the comparison immediately. To this day, the Pam Reynolds case remains one of the most discussed and debated cases in the history of near-death research. Our purpose today is not to decide what happened. It is simply to acknowledge that reports like these continue to raise questions. Questions about consciousness and about whether our inner experience might be more complex than the physical body alone. The Pam Reynolds case is only one account, and by itself it cannot possibly settle a question as profound as the nature of consciousness. But it naturally leads to another question. If some people report perceiving the world while they are close to death, have similar experiences ever been reported under entirely different circumstances? Surprisingly, they have. Unlike near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences do not necessarily occur when a person is close to death. People from many different cultures have reported moments in which they experienced consciousness as existing outside the physical body. Sometimes during meditation, sometimes during deep relaxation, sometimes spontaneously, and occasionally during moments of intense physical or emotional stress. Many descriptions are remarkably similar. People often report perceiving their physical body from an external point of view, moving through familiar surroundings, or experiencing an unusual sense of clarity and freedom. Some even claim to have perceived details that they later attempted to verify. One person who became deeply interested in these reports was an American radio executive named Robert Monroe. After experiencing what he believed to be spontaneous out-of-body experiences, Monroe began documenting them with unusual care. Rather than dismissing them, he devoted much of his life to investigating altered states of consciousness, eventually founding what became known as the Monroe Institute. Over the years, its researchers developed techniques designed to explore altered states of awareness, and their work attracted the attention of people from many different backgrounds. One of those programs, known as the Gateway Process, was later examined in an analytical report prepared for the US Army. Decades later, after that report became widely available, it sparked renewed public interest around the world. Naturally, reports like these and the interpretations surrounding them remain the subject of ongoing scientific debate. Our goal today is not to decide where the truth ultimately lies. It is simply to recognize that experiences of this kind have inspired decades of careful personal exploration, scientific curiosity, institutional interest, and continuing discussion. Together with near-death experiences, they leave us with the same unanswered question. If consciousness can sometimes be experienced as separate from the physical body, what exactly is it that is experiencing the world? Near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences share one important characteristic. They are reported by adults describing extraordinary experiences from their own lives. But our investigation encounters one more category of reports, perhaps the most unexpected of all. Reports that begin not at the end of life, but at the very beginning of it. For more than half a century, researchers have documented thousands of cases in which very young children began speaking spontaneously about what they believed to be a previous life. Many were only 2 or 3 years old. Some described places they had never visited, people they claimed to know, families they insisted were their own, or events they believed had happened before they were born. One of the pioneers in investigating such reports was psychiatrist Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. Rather than beginning with a theory, Stevenson began with a question. Could these children's statements be carefully documented and independently verified wherever possible? Over several decades, he and later researchers collected and investigated thousands of cases from many different cultures around the world. One of the best-known modern examples is the case of James Leininger. As a very young child, James began suffering from recurring nightmares. He repeatedly spoke about being a World War II fighter pilot, described details of aircraft that seemed unusually specific for his age, and gave information that his parents eventually attempted to investigate. Over time, they discovered striking correspondences between many of James's statements and the life of an American pilot named James Houston Jr., who had died during the Second World War. To this day, the Leininger case remains one of the most widely discussed and carefully examined cases in this field of research. Naturally, different explanations have been proposed, and the interpretation of these cases remains the subject of ongoing debate. But regardless of where one ultimately stands, the sheer number of cases that researchers have considered worthy of careful documentation is stunning. By now, our investigation has encountered 3 very different kinds of human experience. Experiences reported near death. Experiences reported outside the body. And memories reported at the very beginning of life. Different people, different circumstances. Yet, all 3 leave us facing the same question. Could consciousness be more complex than we currently understand? So far, our investigation has explored 2 different kinds of clues. The first came from humanity's great spiritual traditions. The second came from people's own experiences. But there is one more question worth asking. Have there ever been reports suggesting that people acquired information without relying on the ordinary physical senses? If so, how should we understand them? Long before the rise of modern science, the ancient world was already fascinated by this question. Among the most famous examples was the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece. For centuries, people from every corner of the Greek world traveled there seeking guidance. Among them was King Croesus of Lydia. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Croesus wanted to discover whether any oracle truly possessed extraordinary knowledge. So he devised an unusual test. He sent messengers to several famous oracles with identical instructions. On the 100th day, they were all to ask the same question: what is King Croesus doing at this very moment? Croesus deliberately chose an action that seemed impossible to guess. He cooked the meat of a lamb together with the meat of a tortoise inside a bronze vessel covered with a bronze lid. When the messengers returned, only one oracle gave the answer Croesus believed to be correct: the Oracle at Delphi. According to Herodotus, the Pythia described the strange scene in remarkable detail. I quote, "I know the number of the grains of sand and the measure of the sea. I understand the dumb, and I hear him who does not speak. The smell of a boiled tortoise has come to my senses, mixed with the flesh of a lamb. The bronze is laid beneath it, and the bronze is put upon it." Unquote. The Pythia was, however, not the only figure surrounded by such stories. Ancient literature contains similar accounts involving figures such as Apollonius of Tyana, reminding us that reports of extraordinary perception were part of a much broader conversation in the ancient world. Whether one accepts these accounts as history, legend, or something in between, it has fascinated people for more than 2,000 years. Not because they absolutely prove anything, but because they ask a question that refuses to disappear. Can human beings, under certain circumstances, sometimes acquire information that they could not have obtained through the ordinary senses? The story of King Croesus belongs to the ancient world, but questions about extraordinary perception did not disappear with antiquity. In the 20th century, a number of researchers began asking whether such claims could be investigated using modern scientific methods. One of the best-known examples emerged at the Stanford Research Institute in California. There, physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ began exploring reports that some people appeared capable of describing distant locations without physically being there. The experiments became known as remote viewing. Participants were asked to describe places, objects, or activities that were hidden from them, sometimes located many kilometers away. Some of the reported results attracted considerable attention, not only among researchers, but also within US government agencies, which later supported further investigation into these claims. Naturally, the interpretation of these experiments remains the subject of ongoing scientific debate. Some researchers argue that certain results deserve continued investigation. Others believe they can be explained through more conventional factors. Our purpose today is not to settle that debate. It is simply to recognize that the possibility of acquiring information beyond the ordinary senses has not remained only a subject of ancient stories. It has also become a subject of modern scientific curiosity. And once again, our investigation arrives at the same question. Could there be aspects of human perception that we do not yet fully understand? The remote viewing studies were not the only attempt to investigate these questions. Over the years, researchers proposed a variety of experimental approaches, each designed to explore whether information could ever be acquired beyond the ordinary senses, while reducing conventional explanations as much as possible. Among the best known were the Ganzfeld Experiments. Beginning in the 1970s, researchers designed experiments intended to minimize ordinary sensory input. Typically, one participant, known as the receiver, rested in a quiet environment, while another participant, the sender, concentrated on a randomly selected image or short video located elsewhere. Afterwards, the receiver was asked to describe any impressions that came to his consciousness. Researchers then compared those descriptions with several possible targets, one of which had actually been viewed by the sender. Over the decades, many laboratories repeated variations of these experiments. Some researchers reported statistical results that they believed were difficult to explain by chance alone. Others questioned the experimental methods or argued that the findings could not be consistently replicated. As with the other examples we have explored, there is no scientific consensus. Yet what is perhaps most striking is not that everyone reached the same conclusion. It is that one of humanity's oldest questions continued to be explored using the tools of modern science. Whatever the final answers may be, the investigation continues. Now, let's pause for a moment and look back at the journey we've just taken. We began with humanity's great contemplative traditions. Civilizations separated by geography, language, history, and culture. Yet many of them arrived at a remarkably similar intuition: that the human being is more than the physical body alone. We then turned to human experience, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and children's reports that continue to be studied today, all raising questions that remain the subject of ongoing investigation. Finally, we explored modern attempts to investigate whether aspects of human perception might extend beyond the ordinary senses. Different methods, different researchers, different conclusions. Yet the same enduring curiosity. Now, none of these examples, taken on their own, prove the existence of a subtle structure of the human being. It was not our purpose to prove anything beyond doubt, as such a proof would probably require complex devices that the human race is yet to discover. But when independent traditions, personal experiences, and scientific investigations all continue to circle around a similar possibility, perhaps the question itself deserves our attention. Because one idea from our previous episode now returns with renewed significance. In the physical world, resonance occurs whenever a system responds much more strongly to certain frequencies than to others. We encounter this principle all around us. Strike one tuning fork and another tuning fork tuned to the same frequency begins to vibrate. Pluck a guitar string and nearby strings tuned to the same note can begin vibrating as well. A radio receiver works on the same general principle, selecting one frequency from countless broadcasts that continually surround us. Different examples, one common principle. Resonance is never just about the signal. It is also about the structure capable of responding to that signal. And suddenly, everything we've explored in this episode takes on a new perspective. If the human being possesses only a physical structure, then we would naturally expect resonance only with the physical world. But if there also exists a subtle dimension to our nature, then perhaps we have discovered something profoundly important. Not proof, but a candidate. A candidate for the very resonator through which the law of occult resonance, explored in our previous episode, might actually operate. And that leaves us with one final question. If there really is a subtle receiver within us, what exactly is it capable of resonating with? If the human being possesses a subtle resonator, what is the nature of the reality it may be responding to? Throughout history, countless traditions have spoken of ubiquitous subtle energies, vast subtle dimensions, and worlds beyond our own, invisible beings and entities, and also what many have called the attributes of God. Are these simply symbolic ideas, or could they represent different aspects of a reality humanity has been attempting to describe for thousands of years? That is the investigation we begin next time.